Let's have a look at what's happening with John McDonnell in Flow News 24's desk in Canberra, and he says the need for a national energy plan is urgent. Despite some ructions from the Nationals and the Prime Minister with the nudging towards this carbon neutrality, which could occur by 2050, the Prime Minister will probably announce adoption of the target shortly before the Glasgow Climate Conference at the end of the year, writes John. He won't need to make a commitment to get a ticket to Joe Biden's climate summit because Australia has been declared one of the current frontrunners in reducing emissions, and this will bitterly disappoint the Greens and the member for Warringah, Carly Stegel. And an assessment by a number of climate scientists who were authors of the International Panel on Climate Change reports found that Australia was one of the few countries that was likely to meet its 2030 Paris Agreement commitments. The study by the Universal Ecological Fund found that none of the large emitters who had signed up to the CN 2050 targets was likely to meet their 2030 target. China had increased emissions by 80% since 2005, and India would double CO2 emissions from 2005 to 2018, said John. The International Energy Agency has calculated that in order to meet the CN 2050 target, primary energy demand has to fall by 17% from 2019 levels by the year 2030. This would return energy demand to the 1970s levels, despite the economy being twice as big as then. Emissions from the power sector will have to decline by 60% over the same period, and this will require a quintupling, or 5 times the amount of solar energy production over the same period. The overall share of energy generated by renewables will have to move to 60% by 2030, says John. And to put this in perspective, Australia will have to build the equivalent of 70 new wind turbines every day to the year 2030, or 5 square kilometres of solar every day until 2030 if electricity demands continue to grow at the current rate. The alternative is a massive closure of industries, and this shift has to be managed on a national basis. The shift will have to meet the benchmarks that the government has enunciated, that is, that energy has to be affordable and reliable, as well as meeting the emissions targets. At the moment, the states, flushed with the power they held during the pandemic response, have decided to go it alone. All of the states and territories have adopted a CN 2050 without any plan to achieve it. Victoria has even declared it will take itself off the grid and adopt a state of electricity independence. I guess like it developing a state of emergency independently. None of the states has addressed the issues of reconstruction of the grid to absorb the massive influx of renewables. It is notable that South Australia's interconnector has run into resistance from locals in Susan Lee's electorate of Farrer, who are fearful of radiation from transmission lines and want the interconnector relocated. The states have also not come to terms with the problem of backup or baseload power. The major developed countries, including the United States, that have committed to CN 2050 have all adopted nuclear energy as their base load power. The government has indicated a preference for gas, although the Australian Energy Market Operator, the AEMO, has predicted that coal will supply 20% of the generated power in 2030. This raises the question of what will happen if states decide to emulate the ACT and refuse to use coal-fired power. If the Morrison government wants to adopt a CN 2050 commitment, it will have to bite the bullet and deliver a national energy plan, writes John. And it may be something that's going to be hard to deliver on because you've got banks like the ANZ entering the fray with its decision in the recent time to not back the Hunter Valley coal market. I guess that becomes the question here, doesn't it? You're going to have all sorts of people for political reasons doing political things, but China and India and other countries that are developing are going to buy our coal and are going to use our coal and are not going to meet their CN 2030 targets, let alone their CN 2050 targets. And yet we're going through all of this with a risk to our manufacturing industries. It's an interesting article. You can read it at flownews24.com.au.